This is U.S. History Regents Review, Unit 3, and our final video. We're talking about the conflict between laborers, labor unions, and employers, the people who own these large companies and are usually very wealthy. And our big themes here are that during this time period, labor unions had little success because they had no support from employers. They did not have a legal right to exist, and the government always sided with the businesses. And over here on the chart on the right, you can see some of the examples of these conflicts where people died. And usually these really big strikes, like the railroad strike, shut down most of the country's railroads. They always ended on the side of the employers. So the government would send in the military, they send in the police, the president got involved in a few, and a lot of the times the strikers are the ones who would get beat up. They would fire these workers, they would arrest them, they could be blacklisted, never get a job again. Things just don't go well for unions at the end of the 1800s. The government does start to try to regulate business. They do see the ways that a lack of competition is not really good for anyone. So they create the Interstate Commerce Commission to oversee interstate commerce, but it's kind of ineffective. And they passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. This made trusts illegal, but it really was not enforced. It was challenging. And one of the reasons this is because of the Supreme Court case, United States versus E.C. Knight Company. This was a big sugar refining company. And without knowing all the details, you don't need to worry about that. Just understand that the decision was that the Sherman Antitrust Act, which they tried to use to break up this company, couldn't break it up because it was seen as just a manufacturing company instead of doing trade. Basically just weakened the Sherman Antitrust Act and said, hey, the federal government actually is not going to regulate trusts, at least not yet. The last thing we need to talk about with industrialization is immigrants. Why are immigrants coming? They're coming to the United States in huge numbers to look for opportunities. The main reason is jobs. People want economic opportunities, but many of them also want political and economic freedoms. We sometimes call this push factors versus pull factors. A push factor is the reason you're leaving your country. So conditions can be really awful. There's not enough opportunities for work, or there's political oppression and poverty. Like the Irish potato famine, for example, was a huge push factor earlier in the 1800s for people to leave Ireland and instead come to the United States. And a pull factor is a reason to come here because they understood that there were a lot of jobs available. And a lot of companies actually sent representatives to European countries to advertise jobs in small towns, these labor contractors. In the end of the 1800s, they started processing immigrants through Ellis Island in New York City. Later, they created Angel Island in California to process immigrants. And when they would arrive, a lot of political machines would try to garner these immigrant votes by providing support, helping them find a job and get set up. And then they would expect them in turn to vote for their political party. So in most cities, like New York City especially, most immigrants became Democrats because the Democratic Party, Tammany Hall, would try to attract their vote. The type of immigrants who came really changed, though, at the end of the 1800s. So take a look at this chart. Old immigrants, these are people coming before 1880. They mostly came from Northern and Western Europe. So that would be like people from Ireland, Scotland, Germany. Most of them were Protestant Christians, and this means they were really culturally similar to the original American settlers, people from English descent or even French. And they settled both in cities and rural areas. So, for the most part, although the Irish were in that group and they faced the most discrimination because a lot of them are Catholic, when these new immigrants arrive, in the 1880s to 1910s, they face a lot of discrimination because these are people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. So this would include people from Italy, from modern day Poland, Russians, Greeks. These people were Jewish or Orthodox Christian, some more Catholics. And this was really culturally different from the original American settlers. The idea of a WASP, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. These people don't really fit that category. And a lot of them stayed in cities. They stayed in districts with other immigrants, like especially New York City. And people did not like them. Sadly, these new immigrants, they face a lot of opposition with this word we call nativism. It's a dislike of immigrants and a preference for people born in the United States. And if you look at this chart here, you can really see the way that immigration shifted. So the green, Northwestern Europe, 1860s, that was most immigrants. But we see a huge change by the early 1900s. Most of them, this pink is Central and Eastern Europe, and the blue is Southern Europe. We see they make up the mass number of immigrants, and that in general, immigration rapidly increased. So this created social tensions and increasing nativism. They did not like them because they accused them of taking their jobs, bringing diseases, and weakening American institutions, meaning they wouldn't know how to vote, they don't understand democracy, they don't speak English, and they had a big problem with them. This is a huge theme throughout all of American history, is that we see at times immigrants are desired to help the economy and to bring in work when we want them, but the second we don't need that work, immigration policies tend to restrict immigration and oppose it, and Americans accuse them of the same things, taking their jobs and ruining our culture. They struggled, these new immigrants especially, with assimilation, that melting pot theory, the idea that everyone brings their unique cultural ideas. We are all just a big happy melting pot. Some people got annoyed that they would live in immigrant communities and not really blend in and not really learn English. They got this negative nickname, scabs. When some immigrants would ruin a strike, people would go on strike in a factory, and then immigrants who don't really know otherwise would come in and take their jobs. They moved to crowded tenements. That's the only kind of housing they could get, which were crowded and unsanitary, and people thought it's just because these immigrants are dirty people. And so this culminates in some major legislation to ban immigration. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act completely banned Chinese immigrants from coming to this country. There was also a gentleman's agreement with Japan. Basically, they want to get rid of Asians. There was a lot of discrimination, especially in California, which we'll see again. And then the Immigration Act of 1924 and the quota system that was created was meant to limit the number of immigrants in total, but it especially curbed it so that people from Northern and Western Europe would be preferred over these new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. So we see that discrimination in trying to pick and choose what kinds of immigrants we want. And if you look at this awful cartoon, you see Uncle Sam literally kicking out a Chinese person. So we'll finish with document moment. This is from 1924 as the Immigration Act is being passed. So the senator, he talks about America of the melting pot comes to an end. And here's the newspaper cover. America was beginning also to smart under the irritation of her foreign colonies. Those groups of aliens, either in city slums or in country districts, who speak a foreign language and live a foreign life, and who want neither to learn our common speech nor to share our common life. From all this has grown the conviction that it was best for America that our incoming immigrants should hereafter be of the same races as those of us who are already here, so that each year's immigration should go so far as possible to be a miniature America, resembling in national origins the persons who are already settled in this country. This is his reason for supporting the Immigration Act of 1924.